Welcome to the Parenting with Impact podcast with your hosts Elaine Taylor-Klaus and Diane Dempster, co-creators of ImpactParents.com, an online community, award-winning blog, and service organization helping parents all over the world to raise complex kids become capable, independent adults. Elaine and Diane are certified coaches with personal experience raising children with challenges such as ADHD, anxiety, and more, and extensive experience in guiding parents to raise their complex kids with confidence and calm. On the podcast, Elaine and Diane interview experts, bringing you cutting-edge information about your child's challenges, teach you real-life strategies to create lasting change, and demonstrate how coaching can guide you to parent your complex kids, one conversation at a time. For the essentials of Elaine and Diane's coach approach to parenting, download a free tip sheet at impactparents.com/podcast.
Welcome back, everybody, to another stimulating conversation in the Parenting with Impact podcast. I am super excited to have this conversation for personal reasons, for professional reasons. Our guest today is Marc Smolowitz, who is a film producer, a longtime, lifelong advocate of the queer community, of the gifted community, of so many others. You've got a body of work that really has used your art and your craft to change the world in profound and powerful ways. So really honor the work that you've done. I got a chance to look at some of it before we've met, and I'm really excited to have this conversation. So Marc, welcome.
Thank you so much, Elaine. It's really my treat to be here to talk to you today.
I'm so excited. So we're going to dive in, y'all. I want you to tell us a little bit about how you came to be doing the work that you do that supports families of what we like to call complex kids. Today, we're going to talk specifically about trans youth and giftedness. There's a documentary you're working on in particular that we're going to talk about. So tell us how you got here. Like, why this? Why now?
Great. Well, first of all, I love the phrase complex kids. I meet and interact with complex kids all the time. I was probably a pretty complex kid myself.
As was I.
Yeah, I was a gifted young person in the 70s. I was a product of gifted education in the public schools in the 70s. I am openly queer. I am an ally of trans people of all ages. And I really lean into, gender diversity, which is, non-binary, non-conforming. There's a lot of different ways that folks who are gender diverse express their identities. And I celebrate them all. That's awesome. how I roll. So I am an independent filmmaker. I'm very fortunate to do the work that I love, based in San Francisco. I've been in the industry for 30 years, and I have made many movies about LGBTQ plus issues. I've worked with a number of trans artists and helped tell their stories. There have been trans characters and trans issues in many of my films over the years. And the way that I sort of jokingly and lovingly describe it is that I didn't just, wake up in 2015 and start thinking about the trans community when Laverne Cox appeared on the cover of Time magazine. Now, that was a critically important moment for trans folk facing the mainstream, and she's an amazing face of that. But I have been in community with folks for 30 years. I came of age in the late 80s, early 90s as part of the AIDS movement. So I was an activist in the ACT UP group in Queer Nation. And that was a critically defined time for me in my life where I really expanded the sort of definition of diversity, for myself and for the communities that I wanted to sort of be a part of and also help support and walk the walk with and for. So the concept of allyship was a very early kind of epiphany for me. I was in many rooms as a young activist and a young filmmaker where there were trans folk who felt invisible. Many identified more in the drag community, which may be very familiar to your followers because of, RuPaul's Drag Race and all that wonderful mainstream success. But there have been folks doing drag for a long time. And a lot of folks who were sort of in the drag space were actually trans and gender diverse. And it was sort of safer for them to be in the drag space, in the gay and lesbian community in that context. And then the 90s started to kind of break open these discussions in our gay and lesbian community. We first embraced the word queer. And the concept of the word queer was actually quite intentional. It was a word that we grabbed hold of because other people used it to hurt us.
I was going to say reclaimed the word queer is how I would I would frame it.
That's the next word that was going to come out of my mouth. It was about reclaiming a negative word and making it a powerful word for ourselves. And there's lots of photo archives of me standing at Queer Nation protests, kissing boys and holding signs. And, I did, that whole sort of visibility movement in the 90s. And then, of course, and then the gay community became quite mainstream, as a result of that success. Moving through the arc of my life and my work, the way I describe community and how this has all have evolved over years is that, we take 10 steps forward, 4 steps back, 8 steps forward, 23 steps back. Culture shifts, culture changes, and identities are always in the mix in how those changes move us along as a civil society. Interestingly, when I started making the movie that we're here to talk a little bit about here today, which is called The G Word, it's a film that's broadly about giftedness. Right. And that movie began in 2012. The first email came in my inbox in 2012 and sort of piqued my interest. And I started to see that because I had been a gifted kid, I had been someone who had benefited from gifted education in the public schools in the 1970s. I remembered what that felt like. I remembered what it felt like to be met as a student at my level, to be surrounded by other students who got me and vice versa, and teachers and administrators who got me and vice versa, right? And so,
what an amazing gift that is.
Exactly. When gifted education works, it is a gift. It's the absolute gift. It's such an interesting sort of, double meaning there. So I had great memories. And then as I was doing my research, I saw many traumatic narratives. That was what was immediately confronting me. This kind of grew over several years. I knew that if I was going to be the first filmmaker to really make the largest, most ambitious film about giftedness in the documentary space, that I better do it right, and that it had to be deeply researched, and that it had to be founded on deep networks of trust and collaboration with folks who've been doing the work in the community for years. I don't believe in just sort of showing up and throwing cameras on people. I have to make sure that I'm the right filmmaker, that I can be of service, and that there's some important, impactful work here to be done. And
let me just interrupt for 1 second, because what I want to acknowledge in what you're saying is that when you're dealing with traumatic narratives and you're dealing with anything in that realm of trauma, being trauma informed is an essential part of serving and moving the needle forward instead of throwing people back. And so that awareness you bring was part of really honoring the trauma that people experience.
As someone who had been living with HIV for a long time, my background is I'm Jewish, and my mother and grandparents were Holocaust survivors from Poland. So I had that sort of understanding of how intergenerational trauma sort of rings on my actual physical body as well as in my DNA. Right. Those were all things I understood very, very early on in my journey. And for whatever, sort of gifts from, the gods and goddesses, I was able to be someone who could sort of tap into wells of resiliency for myself and for others. And that's not always the case for folks who live with and through trauma, right? For some folks, it can just be,
devastating,
paralyzing and devastating. Right. And, and I'm not saying I haven't had my challenges, I certainly have, but I think for whatever reason, I think the power of storytelling and my skills and my craft over the arc of my adult life have really allowed me to sort of, learn how to take care of myself, do the same on behalf of others at times. So that was sort of the message that was coming through in the gifted community, that this is the guy who's going to make a movie that is trying to be inclusive, trying to honor diversity, definitely thinking about equity. As we went public that I was making the movie, I had landed on a question that I was asking, which is who gets to be gifted in America and why? And
huge.
And all about access, all about equity, and then kind of found stories around this great nation that I wanted to tell. There's actually 7 of them in the movie, and one of them is queer. And I always highlight that just one is queer. So, it's like just one of 7, right?
So can I ask you a question about it? Because in my experience with that, because there's a lot of ways that equity and diversity show up, because I work with a population of neurodiversity. Oftentimes, really, really, really bright, gifted kids are not given access to gifted education because there's a learning disability, and ADHD is something else that's interfering, and they don't meet the criteria. They don't, hit that number on the test, whatever it is.
Absolutely. So this was, clear very early on as I was developing the movie. In this sort of gifted world, they talk about they use the word exceptionalities, right? So twice exceptional or thrice exceptional or multi-exceptional. And this idea that someone can be very smart and gifted on the one hand, but have some learning differences on the other, that is at the backbone of this movie, right? So the idea of this movie is that neurodiversity is actually a vertical of identity that is as important and critical in the 21st century as sex, gender, race, class, and zip code. Okay. Our stories they're kind of peppered with neurodiversity all across everyone that we tell. There's one that is super focused on telling you that journey through the sort of lens of a twice exceptional set of twins and their mom and kind of micro school that she formed out of a homeschooling community to sort of helps really save their lives. And there's a lot of gender diversity in her school, as you can imagine. But what started to happen was that as I started doing public speaking at gifted conferences, and I was openly gay, confidently so, talking the talk of, sort of all these different things that were going on in gifted. One of the stories I had uncovered, I met two young people in Los Angeles who were part of an early entrance program at Cal State Los Angeles. So for your listeners and watchers, there are about 12 universities around the country that allow tweens and teens who are gifted to go to college full time. And many of them are in prestigious schools that, we would expect them to be at. But I found one at Cal State Los Angeles, which is a public university in inner city LA, multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual people, ages 11 to 80, at school, right? And I was quite interested in those 11-year-olds, like what gets an 11-year-old interested in going to college full time? How does that happen, right? That was the first story that I identified, because I had grown up in Los Angeles part of my life, and I was really interested in sort of the diversity of that place in the country. And I sat with 6 young people that the program had kind of chosen for me to meet. I did some pre-interviews, and I had 6 people that I identified that I wanted to kind of spend a week with. And 2 of them came out to me on camera. And one of them came out to me as being sort of on a gender journey, and sort of explained that they had just, kind of begun the journey of a name change. And so, as the queer filmmaker who they were talking to, they felt comfortable with me. They trusted me. They wanted to tell their story.
I was going to say, and they knew what they were doing.
Yes. Oh, God.
Right.
2 very, very smart people. Right. And their names are Elaine and Church. And long story short, it's now 6 years later, and both of them they're now a romantic couple. Wow. Elaine has transitioned. Church is sort of, non-binary trans and on hormones, hasn't done the full transition, but is sort of in that zone. And they live in Savannah, Georgia, and I have kind of continued to follow them over the arc of making the movie. So you see them sort of before transition, very early on, beginning their gender journey. And then you see them now really as these very fully realized folks who, and together, the 2 of them helped me explore in the movie the ways that gender, identity, the brain, creativity, neurodiversity, and intelligence kind of all intersect under the banner of giftedness. And it's really quite moving. It's really, really quite moving. And
can you hit those again? Because that was really... Do you think
it's gender, identity, creativity, the brain, neurodiversity, how all those things sort of come together under the banner of giftedness, So our movie really believes that giftedness and neurodiversity are part of the same conversation. I'm really an advocate for that. Most of the folks in the gifted world that I interact with, that we try to support, that we're in partnership with through our movie, also advocate for that. I think there are a lot of neurodiverse advocates who don't feel like they're a part of the gifted world. And so there's sort of...
Well, it has to do with how performance shows up. So I would say that when parents call me, there are 2 things I hear from parents more than anything else. One is I'm desperate.
Yes.
And the other is, and so we have, in that case, it's about how do I get you out of desperation and into inspiration so you can really support your kid. Right. And then the other is my kid's really smart, but.
Yep.
And so when a really, really smart kid is underperforming for whatever reason, that connection to giftedness feels really far away.
Right. Exactly. And I think part of what is so interesting in what you just described is that it is so locked in by our binary perceptions of like sort of how language helps us think about smart, dumb,
right.
Up, queer, straight, it's not, everything is, these things exist more in liminal spaces in between. And most folks are somewhere on a continuum. No one is just one thing over here, right? We're always swinging, we're always on a journey, and our identities really inform how our brains, how our intelligence actually interact with civil society and school. And that, first 18 years or so of your life are such a critical part of how your identities are formed. And so when I started speaking at these gifted conferences, first of all, two things happened. One, I noticed that there were a lot of trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming tweens and teens and young people in the room that
right.
could not see it. How could I not see it? Because I've spent my whole adult life interacting with trans folks.
Exactly.
Right. And then their parents were coming up to me and wanting to talk about the pronoun thing and wanting to understand right. how they could be a better advocate for their child and wanting to talk about how giftedness and transness and gender diversity are playing out in their family story and in their school. Early on in 2017, I met a mom at a conference who, when I met her, she was a shell of a person in many ways. She was challenged by two gender diverse children in a suburban district in greater Minneapolis, and really having a hard time. Well, I don't want to take credit for this, but 5 years later, she's now on the school board and she's now doing deep community work on behalf of other families who are in a similar situation. And this is something I see a lot in the gifted and twice exceptional milieu are parents who have an epiphany. They do incredibly powerful and advocating on behalf of their children, but then they transfer that into helping other families and their larger community.
Or parents who make it through the gauntlet and then realize, my story is I didn't want other parents to go through what I went through those first 10 years, but I couldn't have done anything about it while I was in the middle of it. It had to be after I'd gotten through it and started figuring out how to navigate being with it differently that I was able to come back and give back. Yeah. So sometimes it's about going through the arc of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And most parents want to give back because they don't want to see other families suffer. And families and schools and communities, want to be virtuous, kind of spaces. And
they do. Their intention is good most of the time. Yeah. So I want to be mindful of our time here, Marc, because I love your story and I think it's really useful for parents. And I want to focus us a little bit. It strikes me that in the early years you were part of ACT UP, right? So we're here, get used to it. And you've now spent 3 decades since helping people get used to it.
Yes.
So I really want to honor that work, right? So what do you want parents of these complex kids with trans youth, with giftedness, what do you want them to understand better so that they can have an impact, a positive impact on their kids as they want?
Absolutely. Well, what I want them to first understand is that they're not alone. That's a critically important message. I want them to understand that, yes, their priority is to be there and support their child, but they also have to take care of themselves and that they're also on their own journey. Okay. One of the movies I worked on, which is a really powerful film that I recommend everyone who's listening watch, is called Real Boy. It came out in 2016.
It's called Real Boy.
REAL, Real Boy, about a young trans kid and his journey. And one of the most critical aspects of that story is his mom, right? And his mom's journey and how she was initially very on board having a lesbian queer daughter. And then when she understood that she had a trans son, it was much more difficult for her. So I think parents have to really lean into the fact that they're on a journey too, right? And so they're learning how to sort of, be a parent of a trans or gender non-binary child. And they're going to be playing catch up, right? They're going to have to work that much harder to get used to changing how they speak and, opt in for they, them, and, and sort of different ways of thinking about language and how to describe their own experience as a parent, right? I mean, one thing that I always say, and maybe you've heard this or know this yourself, is that they, them is a singular pronoun. Okay. It is grammatically correct. is endorsed by dictionaries and journalistic circles. And so we actually can all bring they, them into our speaking and writing patterns and be grammatically correct and respectful if we don't know exactly what someone's gender is. So I typically, as a rule for myself for years, I have first referred to people as they. Or as by their name. Then I jump to he or she, because more often than not, people in my network could be, changing their pronouns, as they're journey evolves.
So let's speak to this for a second, because I love that where you're going is self-care for parents and self-awareness for parents, which is always one of our defaults. And I've had this discussion with my kids, because none of my kids are really what you would call gender conforming in one way or another. And my son believes that there's nobody of this generation that's really gender conforming fully.
We shall see.
Right, we shall see. But there is, so when our process started, when one of my kids started transitioning or becoming aware and sharing that information, we started saying, hang on, give me a second to get my head around this. And the feedback we got from our kids initially was, this isn't about you, it's about me.
Yeah.
And I was trying to say, yeah, it is about you. And what happens to you is also about me. And I'm trying to get my head around it. So work with me here. My kids, I think, have been very generous in many ways, saying thank you when I use correct pronouns, correcting me gently when I didn't or don't, because I still get it wrong sometimes. And there was this kind of defensiveness from my kids. That's like, this is not about you. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I think that's perfectly normal, right? I mean, a young person who is on a journey with their identity is, very much about, holding that close to their own experience and doesn't want a parent necessarily to be responding to that in real time every minute of every day. That's a natural teenager-y type kind of response to anything a parent might do. But I do think that you are the parent. They are still growing and changing and evolving. And I think what we need to think out loud about is that we have to listen to our kids, trust that they're right. We don't have time for this today, but there are a lot of anti-trans folks and detransition folks and all this craziness that makes me sick, that really don't trust kids. And our gifted kids, our neurodiverse kids, are extremely tuned in to who they are and are able to parse out things in deep and beautiful ways that we have to be excited about, not afraid of, right? And so there is fear in things that are new and different. Parents who have not encountered it before will feel fear, and that's a natural experience. But I do, because parents want their kids to be safe in the world and not be targeted. Which is what
motivates most of the parents who come to me who are trying to figure out, how do I help my kid and still support them? And
Right. Who wants to invite trauma into a child's experience? Who wants to invite discrimination into a child's experience? No one, right? But your child is who they are in front of you, and you have to respond to that. And you also have to expect and fight for your child's school to do the same. Right. So if family and if home and school are a system that are supposed to work towards the well-being and not harm the child, right, which is what I believe.
I was going to say, what a great vision.
Yeah. Right. That's, it's kind of utopia, but it should be how this works. And you have to hold on to those big goals. Right. And so I think that we have to listen to kids. We have to trust them. Most of them are telling us something very true about their gender. They may not have always the right words. And the other thing I'll remind people is that gender starts very early.
Yes.
Differently than sex. Sex can start early, but it typically really kind of kicks into gear at puberty, right? Like that's when romantic love and sex really become quite, a thing for young people. But gender can start to make itself, very clear to a child, as when they're a toddler, and that can really be visible. So there are, we have to be looking at that gender and sex is on a different timeline, right? And while they are often conjoined in conversations around identity and experience, they actually are kind of separate timelines. And so I think it may surprise, some parents that their non-binary child is emerging at ages 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and 9. But now with all the images and media that are available to young people where they're seeing themselves more and diversely at an early age, and their schools are also verifying that this is a real option for them, they're making meaning out of that. And it's not just this creation. This is the main message I want to highlight here today, is that it's not your child fabricating something. They're making meaning out of their identity experience in real time, and they're going to land where they're going to land. And, your job around, whether you choose, trans affirming therapy or certain kinds of hormonal blockers or all this kind of stuff early, that's a personal choice for a parent to kind of work through and decide what the right timeline is for that. The child doesn't get to decide that, right? So I do think you never stop being the parent making the safe, informed healthcare choices that you need to make, but you have to surround yourself with healthcare people who can also have those conversations with you, right?
Consciously and intentionally and informed. So let me ask you a question, because one of the bits of feedback I get from parents, I'm thinking about a mom who called recently with a 12-year-old in the UK who came home and said, I want to go by different pronouns. I want to transition. Part of what happens when you've got kids kind of 12 to 15 is that's a time when kids are already trying on different things. So there is a fear that parents have right now, particularly if there was no evidence leading up to it. Now, I can look back on my kid's life and I can, starting as an infant, I can see the signs. But if there was nothing leading up to it, and you've got a kid who has a tendency to kind of try on things and see what other people are doing and mimic other behaviors, how does a parent know when it's something to really trust and when the kid is just trying something on?
I think even if the child is trying something on, it's something to trust.
Support it. Great.
Yeah, that's my feeling. I think that there are children who will sort of learn about they, them pronouns and want to try them on. Remember what I said before, they're singular pronouns, and they may fit a child's worldview of how they want to see themselves in relationship to their friends, their community, and themselves, right? If they feel like they, them, like that's enough for them to sort of try to experiment with it. Name changes are, who knows what, motivates a child, right? But I think more often than not, like the children who are trying something on, if we support them in that exploration and experimentation, they're gonna land where they need to land. And be their authentic self. And
what you're saying is, at the end of the day, the parent still makes the medical decisions. And so there's this. So the other thing that I see coming up a lot is kids who are beginning to come to their parents and go through it and completely refusing therapy. Any thoughts on that?
That the parents are refusing?
No, the kids are refusing therapy.
Oh, that's interesting. You mean, so their parents notice all these gender changes?
No, the kids are coming up and saying, I want to transition. I want to whatever. Call me by this name. No, I won't go to a therapist.
Oh, okay. Well, if a child is doing well and doesn't need to.
Most of my parents are not dealing with kids who are doing well.
Well, then that feels not, I think, mental health is part of health, right? So if a parent is seeing a kind of mental health journey unfolding for a child and needs outside support, like I would absolutely, encourage a parent to look for that kind of support and to involve the child in that. Whether or not the child wants it, well, sometimes children, don't want things that are good for them, right? So
or they're not ready for it.
Yeah. Or they're not ready. Yeah.
Any messages for parents to use with their kids in that environment?
Wow. I want to sort of honor out loud that I'm not a parent, right? So I'm actively an uncle. I have two beautiful nieces who are in their 20s, and I've been fortunate to have them grow up around me. They're both cisgender and heterosexual, but they've grown up in San Francisco, so they're very liberal, and they've gone to the schools here and they've been exposed. So I've seen things sort of through their eyes, but I also have a number of kind of friends who are, straight and have had kids who I've watched grow up, who have gone through journeys over the last 20, 30 years. And, everything I can say about what I've noticed is that, parents have to trust themselves, and parents can make mistakes and can learn in real time to kind of fix those mistakes and not make those mistakes again. Everyone is imperfect and is on a journey. So if you're a parent and you're struggling how to talk about your kid's health with your kid, like you just have to keep trying. That's the main message. Keep trying.
So, Marc, I could talk to you all day, and we are actually way over time. And so let people know how to find out more about you and about G-Word. And you mentioned another documentary. So anything you want us to include, you can send us. We'll put it in the show notes. But how can people find out more?
Sure. Well, so I'm Marc Smolowitz, and the movie I'm making is The G-Word, about giftedness and neurodiversity in the 21st century, and it's thegwordfilm.com. So you go to our website. It's like that's sort of the repository of where you can learn everything about the movie. What I will highlight there is that we have 6 beautiful short films that are on our website, because as I'm usually making a film like this, I like to make shorts just to kind of figure out my filmmaking style, the characters, the pacing of the editing, the music, the ways I want to tell these stories and address these topics. So if you watch those 6 shorts, you're going to get a nice view of what this movie hopes to be when it's done. Right. We are on a timeline where we're hoping to be done either later this year or early next year.
And this is being filmed in 2022. So either late in 2022 or early 2022.
Yeah, we're in post-production now. So we're editing the feature, and that's a long, beautiful process. It's going very well. But there is one particular short on our site called My Family Still Calls Me Gabby, which will introduce your viewers to Elaine, who is one of our trans characters.
Which is a fabulous short I've seen already, and I highly recommend it.
Thank you. So. And I involved Elaine in creating that short. Elaine is also an animator and an artist, and has been contributing to their story visually, beautifully with their talent. They're quite gifted as a visual artist. So the website will also connect you with our social channels. You'll also see a lot about our impact campaign. We had a Gifted, Talented, Neurodiverse Awareness Week earlier in October last year, and people can watch webinars about a lot of different issues. And I actually had a webinar called We're Here, LGBTQ plus and Gifted, right?
Love it.
And that was it was like a cocktail party on Zoom with people.
I bet.
All ages, all genders, all kinds of queer folks talking with each other about each other. I really encourage people to watch that, because it was a very empowering night for the people who participated. It felt historic to the gifted folks who were involved in it. And I'll make sure you get that direct link. But yeah, we're on social. We're doing a lot of interesting storytelling on Instagram.
You mentioned a documentary, Real Boy, where will you send us some information to be able to access that as well?
I have several films that are kind of, buying about trans folks.
Right.
That I can share those links and learn more about those. And I'm very proud of that work. So
I love it. All right. So before we wrap, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners, or something you hope parents will take away from today?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. It's my treat to talk to you. I feel that this is one of the most important conversations of the century. I feel like gender identity and gender expression is really the frontier of identity in this century. It's sort of like, every other aspect of identity has sort of been on a sort of timeline since the last century. And it really feels like this is a frontier that is being sort of explored and worked out in real time, that is really going to affect the future of our country. And I think that that's a beautiful thing. And that for parents who are out there who are part of making that history happen in real time, listen to your kids, because they're pushing this forward in a way where we're going to learn so much about ourselves. And that really is a beautiful thing, to be living through this moment with them. Yeah,
for sure. As a mom in this realm, all I can tell you is that I am once again learning more from my kids than they ever learned from me. And that if I can stay present to that and open to that, I can see what this generation is going to bring forward for all of us. And it's a beautiful thing. And change is hard. So we have to all sort of support ourselves through that process. I am so excited for your documentary to be done, in particular to share it with my kids. Because I do think particularly one of my kids struggled so much and is so brilliant, and really, really struggled to see themselves as intelligent. And I know that will come through for them in this movie. And so I'm really excited for that. Before we wrap, do you have a favorite quote or motto you'd like to share?
I do have a favorite quote. So my favorite quote is, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." And that's Eleanor Roosevelt. And I use that quote all the time. I start presentations with it. It's in my decks. And it really just resonates for me. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent.
I love it. Fabulous, fabulous. What a great way to end the conversation. Marc, thank you for the work you're doing in the world. And for sharing it with our community. And we'll be definitely in our Facebook community. We have a Facebook community for parents of kids who are dealing with gender issues and neurodiversity. So we'll make sure that's available. in the show notes and all of your resources to that community in particular. And thank you. And to all of you listening, you're doing powerful work just by being here, tuning in, thinking about it, processing it, making those little changes day by day. You make a difference.
You've been listening to the Parenting with Impact podcast with Elaine and Diane. For more information on the Impact Parents community or to join Sanity School for Parents, please visit impactparents.com. If you like what you've heard, please share this podcast with friends who need similar guidance and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.